Okay, this is a recording to demonstrate how to implement multi-user data management applications in rebol. And we're basically dealing with this tutorial, which is linked. If you go to rebol forum, click on the short code examples. If you go all the way down to the bottom, there are some additional links here to some bigger texts and things. And it's linked down here. You can find it in the rebol short examples. And we're gonna deal with some examples that are in the short code examples. If we go about a quarter of the way down or so. I did another video about this little CRUD app, little database type app, card file type app. We're going to take a look at how to convert that into a multi-user network application. What this article is about taking simple little apps like this contact app that's first demonstrated and converting them so that you don't need to use a database, and you can allow multiple users to connect to the application data source on a server, so that multiple users can make changes without overwriting the operations by other users. And typically in all these apps, the way things work, typically load into memory a file, a data file, and you'll make a bunch of changes. The user interface will allow you to create new records and edit and delete and save records. And then when everything's done, and all those operations are done, when the user has made any changes to the data, that data is saved back to a file again. And so the classic problem with this sort of way of dealing with data is if you have two people open that data file and make a bunch of changes, then one of those users will overwrite the work done by the other. So they're each opening the same file, they make their changes, one user saves their data, and then the other person saves their data and overwrites all those changes that the other user has made. So when we get past that, and with rebol it's really easy to do all these things. It's nice to use rebol series operations instead of a database, because those series operations become intimately familiar and we can tune the application to perform the way we want it to. So you can speed up parts of the app that you want, and all the operations can be tuned as you see fit for the application. Rebol also makes the connection and transfer of data between a server and a client very easy. And so all this is explained in the tutorial. We're going to go right into how to actually use this little code. And basically the gist of this whole part of the tutorial is we're creating a little server exec function which lets us do all the data manipulation operations on a server instead of on a local file. And that server, which is here, handles opening a file or dealing with all the data manipulation operations in memory or by saving to a file. So this is the entire framework that's needed for doing this. You can see the server exec function handles sending data to data management commands to the server. It also handles getting response from the server, and it also handles errors. We have a little management here, a little error management that writes to a file, creates a history, and also displays on the server. Right on the server you can see what's going on. If there are any errors, you'll see a printout of those things happening. This is very easy to implement. We just use this generic code, the server code. And in the server, if we're going to open up any file, whether it's the main data file that holds all the records we're manipulating, or if for example, if we have a file that contains passwords and other data that users, clients will need to interact with that come from the server. We'll do that right in the beginning of the server. That's the only thing that ever really needs to change in the server code. And then this server exec function is basically just going to get copied into any application that we're going to convert to a multi-user app. And so that's the basic gist of what we're going to do here. I think this application that's in the tutorial doesn't even need to be that complex. We're going to take this little CRUD app, and there's a video explaining how every single line here and every single function, all of these few lines work to make a basic card file, database app. And we're going to convert this so that it can be used on a network by multiple people. And the basic gist of how to do this comes down to looking for the code in your single user application. All these apps basically open a file, make some changes to the data in that file, and then write that data back to the file. So we're looking for places where we do any sort of opening or closing of files or changing of values in memory in a loaded block of data. So if you look, for example, in this block of code labeled N, there is no data management operation. We're just clearing some fields in the local client, so nothing has to be done there. You look at this little block of code labeled X, we are doing some data management operations. We're going to write to the file whatever's included in these fields in the user interface. Same thing with the Y function, this little block of code called Y. We're doing some loading of the data, and same thing in Z. We're actually loading and saving to a file in Z. It doesn't have to be just loading and saving, though. You could be, making changes to items in a series in a block. Anything that's going to change, either open, change, or save data to a file or to a data structure in memory. We look for those things in the code, and then what happens is here's our new client. This is the network enabled client. So all that's going on here is we've copied that server exec function. We put in the server IP where the server is. We have that separate file, which is run. The server's run, and in the code of the original application, all we need to do is sort of wrap all of those data management functions in this server exec code. So if we go back and look at the original here, for that X block of code, we're going to have to wrap this write operation, and whenever we're sending the server, we're going to basically send this line of code. There is no difference between this line of code in the single user app and that line of code in the network enabled app, except that we're rejoining bits of this code, because any place we have a bit of data that exists only in the client, so for example a variable or some data that's held in a user interface widget style. So for example, in this app we have a field labeled F1, a field labeled F2, and an area labeled A. We send this bit of code to the server to execute on the server. On the server, those things don't exist. It only exists on the client. The area and the field and this field. And so what we need to do is rejoin all of that code together and separate out any of the bits of data that are being sent and mold that data and then rejoin it back into the code that's being sent to the server, because that data does not exist on the server. So we have to get it, mold it, and put it back into the code that's being sent from the server, or sent to the server. So the way this works is, instead of just saving to a file, we have to save to the file on the server. This code is the exact same as this code, except it's sent using the server exec function. And what's sent is a copy of that code, but with the data molded. So we join the whole bit of code to include the molded data. If you look at the Y block of code, you see the same thing happens here. We're loading this little bit of data. So if we look at how that looks here, the only thing that changes is the original loaded data is now loaded from the server exec function. So that server exec function does on the server what was done locally in the client, in the single client app. And one thing to be aware of here, if we're going to load a block of data in the string sent to the server, we have to include toBlock if that data is a block. It's the only thing that has to be added. If we ever load a block, include the toBlock function in the string sent to the server. Otherwise, all the rest of this code is exactly the same. Same thing in the Z block of code here. We're doing a save operation, and we're doing a load operation. And on the server, we're going to be finding within that loaded data a piece of text that only exists on the client. So we're going to need to break up this code, rejoin it, and mold that little bit of text that's in the F1 field. So if we look at that, we have the exact same code going on here. The only thing is that we're executing this now on the server instead of locally. And we have to rejoin that code because we have a piece of data that exists only on the client machine. So when this code gets sent to the server, the actual data that's in the F1 field, the text that's in the F1 field, is going to be molded and rejoined back into this code that's sent to the server. So a pretty simple operation. That's it. That's all you have to do to make the system work. You can take any code that saves data or manages data in memory, in a series in memory, or any other value in memory, and have that done on the server. And anything that has to be manipulated should just be manipulated on the server using the server exec. So a couple things to watch out for again are, if you have data that exists in the client, either in a user interface widget or in a variable that's being manipulated on the client, you have to break that out, mold it, and rejoin it all together back into the code that's sent to the server. Otherwise, this is the exact same code that's in the original application. If you load any data that's a block, make sure in the code that's sent to the server you include that toBlock function. And also, you see, for operations that don't return data, this server exec not only sends the code to the server, but also retrieves the data that's returned by that operation. So this is actually returning and replacing in the code here that value that's returned from the server. If you perform an operation in the server exec function and the code sent by the server exec function which doesn't return data, so for example here we're loading and just saving some data, we're not actually returning a value at the end of this whole operation, you need to return a value of true so that the server exec function knows that the operation was completed successfully. So you can either use true or yes or 1. Just the number 1 also evaluates true. That's it. The text includes a lot more about how to use this. It also, there's a explanation and some code to show you how you can actually get corrupted data if you're trying to write, if multiple users are trying to write at the same time to a file. And there's a whole explanation here about how this code was built up, and there's a little bit bigger example, quite a few other examples. And in these other examples, there are a number of other features. For example, if you want to maintain a username and password list, or if you have other security features that you don't want to include in the code of the client, you can run those features on the server and keep them away from the client entirely. So it demonstrates how to do all that sort of stuff, so that you can create applications that are more secure. And in your code, you can choose which parts of your app you want to run in the client and which parts you want to run on the server. And again, the whole point of doing this is to avoid having to use a third-party database, so you avoid the upgrade and installation hassles, and because you can also more finely control the features and the performance of your app, because you write absolutely every single part of it by hand. And it's also all entirely rebol, so you don't have to worry about how a third-party database or service deals with your data. You choose and modify and optimize things as you see fit for your application. You can choose when data files are stored to disk, and because all of this can happen in memory just as it would in a local application, it's just happening in the memory of the server, the applications perform basically just as fast in a multi-user environment as they would in a single-user environment. You can go through millions of records in a fraction of a second if the database is all held in memory on the server. And typically, what's sent across the network is pieces of code, or typically if it's bits of data, it's single records out of the entire database. There's also a lot here about how to work with IP addresses. You can use UDP to get your IP addresses, and there's more here about using HTML forms, so you don't need anything more than a browser to connect to your network apps. And there are quite a few applications there. In the examples, if you click on more examples here, there are some of those applications that demonstrate some really powerful implementations of that sort of application, little CRUD application makers, and hopefully that's enough to get you going with this. Just copy the server, run it, copy the server exec function, and then wrap any code that deals with data manipulation, saving, loading, manipulating series in memory, and send it to the server using the server exec function. And that's it. That's all it really takes. And so if you want to read a little more, you can read the entire tutorial here that really describes in depth how it all works and gives some much more in-depth examples of applications.